between Europe and Asia, economic dialogue, humanitarian missions, multi-vector operating and the search for compromises in the world arena. How else does Kazakhstan participate in the development of the modern world? For more details, watch the program Kazakhstan International Vectors. Today you will find out how to switch to a gas automobile, what climate changes threaten Kazakhstan, and what is a carbon footprint.
Over the past 100 years, the average temperature on Earth has increased by about 0.6 degrees centigrade. Even such a slight increase in temperature leads to natural anomalies, droughts, severe storms and floods. All this is called climate change. The use of oil, coal and gas as a fuel, as well as deforestation, led to a significant increase in the content of greenhouse gases in the terrestrial atmosphere. They create the effect of heat retention. States are already solving climate problems at their levels, using carbon fuel, and international organizations are developing plans and projects for cooperation in the field of climate security.
Greenhouse gas emissions are one of the main prerequisites for climate change. Despite the fact that energy is recognized one of the main sources of these emissions, even an ordinary car can seriously affect the environment. Even if the car is new and the system is new and not contaminated, the gasoline itself, due to its chemical composition, will have a smell of waste gases. Just look, I can hold my hand like this, yes, and there will be absolutely no smell. It does not cause any discomfort, even if the car will be somewhere in the garage. With the gates closed, you won't absolutely feel any discomfort or smell any carbon monoxide, unlike with a car that runs on gasoline. Thus, advantages of gas are enormous. Timur Kurbanov and his team have been installing gas cylinder equipment on cars in Kazakhstan for 6 years already. He says that during this time, about 800 owners of vehicles in Almaty and the region have installed gas cylinder equipment to their automobiles. Timur notes that since recently the demand for such services among Kazakhstanis is growing. The popularity for such an automobile reconstruction has increased in the recent 2 to 2.5 years. Previously, this process took a long time. People knew little, there was little information on such kind of equipment. Accordingly, the difference between these types of fuel, propane with butane mixture and the regular gasoline, was not so large, and there were no so many gas filling stations in Kazakhstan as there are now. So far, such a trend is determined not by the people's concern for ecology, but by the economic factor. Economically, this is very profitable to install gas cylinder equipment. It is practically 2 times cheaper since gasoline costs 143 to 142 tenge and gas costs 67 tenge. That is, the spending on fuel is almost 2 times lower. Many motorists still do not trust such gas cars, although experts say that it's much more dangerous to drive a car which runs on a regular gasoline. The security system should always work. In this case, you will never have any risks. In fact, gas is safer than gasoline. First, the gasoline tank is very thin, a little thicker than a regular can. Gas tank's volume runs from 3 to 5 millimeters. Depending on the capacity, the thickness goes higher, and it is made from not a simple metal, but from high-tech steel. Compared with public transport, which can transport several people at a time, a private car with only one driver is not environmentally friendly, and such re-equipment significantly reduces the burden on the environment by reducing greenhouse emissions. In terms of ecology, the release of CO2 emissions will be almost 40% lower in terms of gas than in terms of gasoline. Due to what? Gasoline, in its formula, in its chemical composition, contains lead and sulfur. Naturally, these are the elements that do not burn out. They do not burn out totally, and they come out with the release of CO2 and pollute our environment. The gas has no impurities. It burns out completely, reducing these emissions by 40%. Hence, this equipment is both economical and environmentally friendly. Climate changes affect social and economic systems and the life of a person as a whole. The term security provides for the absence of any risks that may serve as an obstacle to development. Food, energy and water security are key aspects of social and economic development in the Central Asia, experts say, since agriculture remains the key industry for the region.
The main impact of the climate change in the Central Asian region is the temperature increase, fluctuations in precipitation and melting of high mountain glaciers and snowfields. All these are main consequences which have very big risk for the development of the agricultural sector, for the development of water resources. If we currently have certain problems related to water scarcity, then under conditions of climate change, the problem will only worsen.
If the region suffers from a shortage of water resources, there will be a risk of food insecurity. Because due to the climate change, natural disasters, for example floods or droughts, may happen that can cause a critical impact on public health. All this will lead to economic and social losses for the whole Central Asia. Therefore, experts insist that it is impossible to consider the issues of climate change only in the context of ecology.
If we talk about Kazakhstan as an example, especially the North Kazakhstan, which is a producer of wheat and cereals, then this region can carry a huge threat of a decline in yields, a decline in production. This is an example of direct economic and financial losses. If you look at other countries, high mountainous countries such as Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, then the intensive melting of glaciers carries a huge risk for the breakthrough of glacial lakes. Flooding will be great. This is now actually happening in the highlands. There will be a huge mud flow, huge avalanches and floods. This all is related primarily to the safety of a human life.
The Regional Environmental Center for Central Asia addresses the issues of climate change and energy sustainability in the region. Experts of this organization assist countries in the development of national policies and programs on climate change and promote the development of renewable energy sources.
Currently, we are carrying out a number of thematic projects related to the issue of climate change, and in particular, I would like to note one of the large-scale projects. It is financed by the World Bank and is called Program for Adaptation to Climate Change and Mitigation of Consequences of the Aral Sea Basin. Here, the work of the whole region is foreseen, and the main task of this project is the generation of new knowledge and the creation of a regional information platform. This is the development of the best methods, maybe tools that will help different users of this platform to obtain not only new knowledge, but also contribute to the improved decision-making process in the field of climate policy.
The results of this project will help to mobilize additional investments in the development of priority sectors, for example, agriculture and water resources. As a consequence, climate risks will decrease. In other words, regions' vulnerability to the effects of climate change will decrease. Kazakhstan's membership in the UN Security Council will attract additional attention to this problem.
I would like to note that Kazakhstan's participation in such international venues will allow us to pay more attention to the potentially existing problem related to climate change and take some preventive measures which will not allow any catastrophic changes happen associated with this sector.
Today, the problem of climate change is on the global agenda. International experts identified two main approaches to combating climate change: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is an attempt to reduce the impact of climate change on the sustainable development of a country.
So, we are basically talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is also very important for Kazakhstan. Why? Because there are many enterprises of heat power which are naturally working on fossil fuels, even here in Almaty. For example, our TPP station that operates on coal. Accordingly, all these emissions into the atmosphere contribute to climate change. And so, if the state does not work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, climate change effect will increase.
For Kazakhstan, as for many other countries, experts predict an increase in temperature and changes in the amount of precipitation. Consequently, from the point of view of agriculture, it will be necessary to abandon the cultivation of certain crops and replace them with others. And this process is called adaptation.
There are national adaptation programs in the developed countries. Similarly, there are obligations of developed states to help forming such programs, and not only forming such programs, but also to carry out such adaptation programs in the less developed states. These are usually the island states that are very much affected by climate change, and including not only the poorest countries, but also the developing countries. At some situations, they help with an advice, and in other situations, they provide additional funding.
The Paris Agreement signed in 2015 is a part of the overall global framework for climate change agreements. Within the framework of this document, a fund has been created in which the developed countries invest. The money will be further directed to adaptation activities in the poorest states.
The Paris Agreement is a document within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which regulates measures to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from 2020. The goal of the agreement is to keep the growth of the global average temperature much lower than 2 degrees centigrade and make an effort to limit the temperature rise about 1.5 degrees centigrade. The text of the agreement does not provide for any sanctions if the parties fail to meet the goals they have declared.
World experts called the Paris Agreement an innovative document because it was for the first time when participants chose for themselves what goals to set, on what indicators to conduct their activities. The decision was taken upon the level of ambitiousness and the readiness of states to work in a climate direction, and of course the financial possibilities of countries' economies were taken into account. After all, measures related to adaptation to climate change are not the cheapest ones, experts say.
That is, if we say that we must abandon coal-fired power plants, then we must build others. It is necessary to use other resources, other technologies. If we say that we need an additional structure to defend ourselves against floods, for example, or against droughts, this is again an investment. Therefore, respectively, including the implementation of the Paris Agreement, for example, states have tried to realistically approach their planning for coming years and understand what they can really do on their part in order to generally limit the issues related to the climate change.
Almost 10 years ago, in the United Nations Environment Programme, a special appointment was created called the UN Ambassador on Climate Change. Back then, the organization has taken up its obligations in this direction. First and foremost, UNEP has identified how climate change can affect the security of nations. On the example of the North African region of Sahel, the so-called hotspots were singled out. These are those areas, those elements that are subject to climate change. For example, it was said that climate change affects the availability of many resources and, as a consequence, migration problems rise.
For example, from the point of view of the work related to climate security, I will cite as an example the state of Kiribati, a small island state. There, the government has included the issues of climate security in general international development strategies. As an example of a very practical kind of activity, they restore mangrove thickets on the banks in order to keep the water levels stay low and hold the banks to avoid erosion. Another infrastructural element of the activity, they make the so-called coastal shafts, like barriers to the waves, do not directly affect the coastal space.
UNEP helps states to combat climate change. The organization representatives say almost always there are means to prevent, reduce or somehow minimize the negative impact on the environment. For this purpose, special projects are being created in cooperation both with states and with other international organizations.
We do not only talk about infrastructural projects like, for example, additional water reservoirs or dams, but we also talk about institutional structures, so that the state perceives these issues for itself and is able to react properly to some changes. For example, its own ecological policies, policies related to climate change, in order to reduce the impact and to try to resist the trials related to environmental safety.
There is such a thing in the world called a carbon footprint. Globally, this is a unit of measure by which we can determine the balance between our needs and the amount of environmental resources that we have in stock.
The carbon footprint determines the degree of impact on the environment of any person, enterprise, organization, settlement, country and population of the whole planet. The magnitude of the carbon footprint is measured in global hectares. The average inhabitant of the Earth needs an equivalent of 2.2 hectares. However, the planet can provide only 1.8 hectares per person.
Today, it is possible to calculate your own footprint on some special websites in the internet. In the meantime, experts recommend not forgetting about your own potential impact on the environment, even when shopping in the store.
The same type of product, for example, can be brought to Almaty from Astana and can be brought here from Africa. And again, all these transportations, they also generate greenhouse gases, they also affect the climate. Therefore, we always say that the most effective and ecologically friendly is the purchase of some local goods, or at least those types of products that have the smallest, let's say, ecological footprint.
Many countries have not only adopted the appropriate state development programs, but have also taken concrete steps. For example, the United Kingdom is going to open a green investment bank to ensure private capital flows into low-carbon technologies. Globally, this sector of the economy is already estimated at more than £3 trillion a year, of which Britain's share is 112 billion. About 1 million Britons are employed in this sector.
Norway stated by 2030 the country's greenhouse gas emissions will be equal to zero. Germany said that by this year they will reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide in particular, for more than 90%. And if you have noticed, these are the developed countries, so we can say that they have in principle necessary technology and far advanced development. But again, if we are talking about the Central Asian region, it is worth noting that our countries also do not stand aside.
In addition, in the world, there are countries which have already abandoned fossil fuels. The Swedish government announced an unprecedented energy reform. The country is going to almost completely abandon the use of hydrocarbon raw materials. Instead, the Swedish energy system will be fully transferred to renewable sources. The country has even established a special ministry for sustainable development.
Many countries are already developing very serious programs to abandon carbon fuels, thereby reducing emissions from greenhouse gases. There is a good example of China. The country is certainly a very serious source of greenhouse gas emissions, but the Chinese state has a very powerful program for the introduction of solar energy and wind power. It means that China is also working very hard in this direction.
Oil and gas sector is the main driver of the economy of Kazakhstan. At first glance, it has nothing to do with the climate, but even here there are certain risks. For example, oil production is concentrated in the basin of the Caspian Sea. In connection with the melting of nearby glaciers, the sea level rises, the water balance is disturbed. All this carries the risks for climate and environmental safety that can directly affect the production of energy in Kazakhstan.
There is a concept of transition to green economy in Kazakhstan, and there are basic provisions on how we are going to reduce emissions. And one of our latest initiatives, we joined the Paris Agreement, which sets out our national commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have signed that by 2030 we commit to reduce our emissions by 15% compared to 1999.
The country has developed a concept for the transition to green economy. The state undertook its obligations to reduce harmful emissions and develop alternative sources of energy. Participation of Kazakhstan in the work of the UN Security Council and holding of such large-scale events as Expo allows the country to additionally attract investments in the development of infrastructure projects to ensure climate security.
Therefore, the issues of climate security are really an important part of the overall security system of the country, and here we already had an experience in working with the Security Council on the climatic direction. Here, opportunities of Kazakhstan, in particular as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, are so that the country is able to raise these issues and consider them in more details.
The car has run for about 1,000 kilometers and now has come here for calibration. Here on the chart we see pressure, speed, temperature, everything. Such an inspection is being performed with every car on which gas cylinder equipment was installed by the specialists at this service station. Here employees are performing their work properly. Not a single automobile is left without attention. In the nearest future, this enterprise plans to expand its client base so that Kazakhstanis can continue reducing their impact on the environment.
Of course, it is important that people are aware that they use the information and, of course, that they take some more active measures just in reducing this negative impact, because this is really the choice of each of us. Yes, it is necessary to reduce the impact on the climate, but it's time to adapt, it's time to face the climate changes in our region. If we are more aware of this or that problem and not just the problem, if we know how to respond to it, what measures to take, even at the individual level, this helps to ensure that this problem will not become such a critical issue tomorrow.
Climate security is an integral part of the national security of not only a single state, but of the entire world. Often climatic changes do not directly depend on the human factor. However, every inhabitant of the planet can contribute to improving the climate security of his or her country.